My name is Mike Pothier. I'm the Program Manager at the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, and my pleasure to welcome you all to our webinar this morning, where we want to try to understand a bit more about the state of police leadership in our country. It goes without saying, I think, that it's a problematic situation, which we will detail a little bit in due course. But in a country like ours, with a number of pressing problems of governance, with a very high crime rate, with high levels of socioeconomic need, etc., we simply cannot afford to have a police service which is in any way dysfunctional. And that is unfortunately the situation in which we find ourselves. So it behoves us as civil society, I think, to deepen our understanding and hopefully find ways of being able to contribute to the resolution of the problem. That is our purpose behind this meeting. This event is co-hosted by Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office and the Hanns Seidel Foundation. As always, we are grateful to HSF for the support, financial and otherwise, that allows us to conduct these events. I'd like to introduce the two panelists that will be speaking to us this morning. Firstly, we have Dr. Sydney Mufamadi, who I'm sure everyone will recall was the first Minister for Safety and Security, as it was then called, post-1994, the first, in other words, democratic minister in charge of police. And Dr. Mufamadi served in that capacity throughout the Mandela government till 1999, when he was then shifted over to become Minister for Provincial and Local Government. And he served almost 2 full terms there until 2008. And then at the time when President Thabo Mbeki was recalled, as we remember, the then Minister Mufamadi was one of those ministers who resigned from government at that point. He then went into academia, took a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London in 2009. And in 2011, Dr. Mufamadi was appointed as Director of the School of Leadership at the University of Johannesburg, and that is where he still is. If you go and look at his bio, of course, you find all sorts of other roles, national and international. But Dr. Mufamadi is here with us today in, I would say, 2 capacities. One as a former minister, who can tell us a lot about the origins, if you like, of the South African Police Service, with the emphasis on service, but also as an academic expert in leadership questions. So those 2 hats. Our other panelist, very well known to us both at the Catholic Parliamentary Office and the Hanns Seidel Foundation, is Gareth Newham from the Institute for Security Studies. Gareth has been there now for about 11 years, I think, as head of the Justice and Violence Prevention Program. And before that, he worked as an advisor to the Gauteng Provincial Minister for Community Safety. So again, a long history in areas of safety, policing, etc. Gareth has his master's degree in Public and Development Management from the University of the Witwatersrand. I'm now going to hand over briefly to Hans Bühler, who is the country representative for the Hanns Seidel Foundation, for a few words of introduction. Thanks, Hans.
Thank you very much, Mike. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, dear Dr. Mufamadi, I see also Rolf Meyer in the audience, the Secretary of Police, Mr. Rapea, and dear colleagues and friends of the Hanns Seidel Foundation. I don't know how you feel this morning, but for me it was a very difficult morning to get out of bed after Germany, my home country, yesterday lost against England. But I don't know, what can you do? Life must go on, and it had to, I think many said, it had to happen sooner or later that Germany loses against England. So I congratulate all English fans, of course, in the audience. But as Mike said, let's focus on a more serious and maybe even more important topic than soccer. Also, some would argue this is not possible. a topic which is not only very close to my heart, but I think human security issues are reflected also by 3 decades of cooperation between the Hanns Seidel Foundation and South Africa. Yesterday, the acting Deputy Chief Justice, Sisi Rampepe, said in a historic judgment by the Constitutional Court that in regards of the role of the judiciary, it is, and I quote now, lofty and lonely work to uphold, protect, and apply the Constitution and the law at any and all costs. I imagine that the same applies for the many highly qualified and professional police officers in the law enforcement agencies too. To be a police leader is a very difficult and challenging profession. Maybe it is one of the most difficult professions within the civil service. This applies for all countries, but I believe it is especially true in the context of South Africa, with the high crime rates, the inequality, and a very complex and fragile social fabric. To be a police officer, and especially also a police leader, is also an honorable and important profession, which should also be reflected in the perception within society. In my home province in Bavaria, one of those 16 provinces forming the Federal Republic of Germany, every second boy or girl at a certain stage want to become a police officer. The police is one of the most trusted professions. And I think this enables also the states to really choose from the best candidates who want to become police officers in the first place. Of course, context and the challenges are completely different. But I should also state that after the Second World War, or even in the 60s and 70s, when student protests broke out in Germany, the image and the trust into the police was very low, and the police was not really able to handle these situations professionally. Police officers present the state authority towards its citizens. This fact alone should be sufficient for selecting the best available police officers to become police leaders based on a proven track record. In countries where police forces are trusted, usually also the trust in the state is in general terms quite high. Therefore, we argue back home in Bavaria and in Germany, it's in the own interest of the state to support efficient and professional police services. And while there are many players who are responsible for safety and security, ranging from the business sector to civil society and other state organizations, the police should remain in the center. It should be the police who is the most important and responsible actor, working together with all other stakeholders, at least in a political system where the rule of law and democracy applies. It should be the police who has the best competence, knowledge, and network for fighting crime efficiently. And through their professional crime fighting work, protecting the citizens and gaining their trust. When we look at the current crime statistics and the many protests relating to the lack of professional police services, it is, I have to say, unfortunately, questionable if the police in South Africa is able to live up to those standards. In a recent ISS Today, the experts from the Institute for Security Studies refer to the low detection rate when it comes to murder, for example. The experts write, and I quote, "Detectives were only able to solve 19 out of 100 murders. 19 out of 100. The record for aggravated robbery is worse, with only 17% being solved." End of quote. When we look at these figures, we should not only think about the perpetrators who are running around, but I think especially about the many victims and their family members who have not seen justice, and all of those who have the feeling they were forgotten by the police or by the state. The rule of law is a crucial cornerstone for democracy. Without people feeling safe, there is the great risk that democratic structures will erode over time. And while prosecution agencies play an important part in the criminal justice system, they will only be able to perform in the long term if the police forwards proper evidence for prosecutions. In other words, prosecution agencies depend on a functioning police. And maybe, ladies and gentlemen, a last thought, also I believe an obvious one. The high crime rates hamper, of course, economic growth and human development. I don't think we can talk about sustainable and inclusive strategies for economic growth without looking at the safety situation of the many South Africans living in high crime areas. There is no development without safety. Many important policing strategies have been developed over the years, also here in South Africa. However, it seems that professional leadership and management on all levels, well-trained and careful selected leaders, and the necessary political awareness is one crucial precondition to implement the developed strategies and reduce crime in the long term. Thank you. Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hanns. I think that gives us a very useful context, a very worrying contextual background as well. Gareth, I'm going to start with you. We've had 9 commissioners or acting police commissioners since 1994. One of them, unfortunately, Jackie Selebi, ended up in prison on corruption charges. The last acting commissioner, Khomotso Pahlane, is facing corruption charges at the moment. Other commissioners have had to resign for a variety of reasons. The National Deputy Commissioner at the moment, Lieutenant General Mgwenya, has been charged with fraud and theft and money laundering. There's also been problems at provincial commissioner level. The former commissioners of both Gauteng and KZN have been charged on corruption-related matters. In the ex-Western Cape, I think he was an acting provincial commissioner, Arno Lemoore, is already in jail for corruption. So can you kind of set the scene for us? What exactly is going on with SAP's leadership? What's the problem?
The one word would be politics. The police leadership situation is a result of political decision-making, because the Constitution gives the President the authority to appoint the National Commissioner of Police and the National Minister of Police. And depending on who they appoint and the kinds of pressures they bring to bear on those appointments, that will determine how those appointed and what they prioritize and how they decide to use the vast resources at their disposal. And because there's been this huge turnover in police leadership, so after Jackie Selebi, from 2008 until 2017, we had 7 different people either permanently or appointed or appointed in an acting position. They then themselves make a whole range of appointments. So the law, Police Act and regulations allow national commissioners to deviate from the prescribed processes upon which you make key positions, appoint people into key positions, create new posts, or transfer people. And so all of them, most of them at least, starting with Jackie Selebi, would make bad appointments themselves into key posts within the South African Police Service. Heads of intelligence, head of inspectorates, the head of detectives, and then as it goes down. So I would say that the problem is a political one. That if the political forces that were at play really prioritized making sure that only the best possible woman or man with the highest level of unquestionable integrity was appointed to the position of the South African Police Service to lead that, and then held them accountable for making sure that all the other appointments and promotions were in line with very clear standards, that we would not have this problem. So I would say that at the root of the problem, it's a political issue.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mufamadi, let me ask you to take us back then to 1994. We now have a democratic government, democratic parliament. A lot of transformations are necessary, and arguably one of the most important transformations would have been from the apartheid era South African police force to a democratic era South African police service. How did you, and more broadly the Mandela government, set about undertaking that transformation, the SAP into the SAPS, and what criteria did you use when choosing the leadership of the new service?
Thanks, Mike, and as well as Hanns and Gareth, fellow panelists, and other members of the meeting. Maybe just quickly, really, to say that, you know, our approach, that is, when we came into government in 1994, was one which has its provenance in the Freedom Charter that promises security for all. And you will see resonances between this promise and what is in the Constitution of the Republic of the country, which is again a guarantee of the right to public safety. Now, that promise itself stands in contrast to what used to be the case before 1994, where you had policing resources that were used to suppress dissent and to enforce the oppressive system of apartheid. So we inherited a police force, which was in the form of the South African police and the police forces of the then 10 homelands.
Yeah.
And by the way, I need to say that all those 11 police forces, members thereof were trained at Hammanskraal on the basis of training material produced by the South African police. So effectively, there were 11 police forces, which were one police force in terms of orientation, in terms of how they were trained. The police, members of the police force were really ill-equipped for the task of leading the fight against crime and providing adequate levels of human security. You know, just talking about literacy levels, the majority of members of the police force, never mind the fact that it was a key instrument of suppression and so on, were Black, most of whom had standard 6, that is grade 8, as their highest academic qualification. So you had Hanns talking about the prosecutability of offenders. The quality of the statement that is taken by a police officer at the charge office will determine the fate of the case. And quite often people in the Justice Department used to tell us that they can't make sense of the statements that are prepared by members of the police when they are recording cases that are brought up, that are reported at police stations. I'm just giving that as an example. But also in the context of what I said about suppressing dissent. The police were trained to see people who are advocating for rights, you know, protesting in the streets, organizing marches and things as the enemy. They would see this march procession as an enemy to be suppressed. Now, in the new situation that we are talking about now, you needed then to address the mindset issue of the members of the police service. You need a new set of skills, diplomatic skills that are required for them to interact with whoever may be exercising their right to protest, treating them impartially in the spirit of non-partisanship, saying these are citizens who have got a right to express dissent and so on. But as I was saying earlier, it became very clear to us that we needed to change the conditions of admission into the police service, to say the lowest qualification, the minimum requirement will be matric, in order to enhance the trainability of people to do what is essentially a highly technical and professional undertaking. It's a skills-intensive undertaking, policing, as I hope it will become evident as we continue to talk. So it meant changing the curriculum for the training of the police. So you are bringing in younger and new people who are trained differently, but you were not necessarily going to manufacture a new police leadership. And not every one of the people who were sitting in senior positions in the police were necessarily trained on the basis of the new curriculum. So there is going to be some dissonance when it comes to people who are giving leadership, yet they are giving leadership to younger people who are trained differently for policing in a new setting altogether from the type of policing that they are used to, where everything comes from the top, decisions are taken at the top. You had ill-equipped, ill-trained police officers on the ground, but these are the ones who are at the coalface of fighting crime every day. They don't have decision-making capabilities. Now you are retraining them in order to ensure that you can devolve decision-making powers to levels where those powers need to be located. But I'm saying then you must be mindful of the dissonance that then exists, that arises between your old senior officers who were trained somewhat differently.
So how did you then set about addressing that dissonance and trying to reconcile it?
Yes, so we introduced new policies. I'll be brief about it. We sought to do away with what existed then as a militaristic culture of policing, replace it with what we called community policing, a new way of policing. Maybe I'll elaborate on it when we start interacting. But all those things required new skills because the skills that were there before were not fit for purpose. Also, the question that I was talking about of public gathering, we started training, on-the-job training around the new Public Gatherings Act and the need for police to have new skills of interacting with the community, which is why in the context of the new community policing culture, we fostered the creation of what we called community policing forums, which were intended to create the necessary partnerships and collaboration between the police and the community. Because indeed there was a trust deficit for obvious reasons between the police and the community. So those are some of the things that we did with a view to turning the situation around. Lastly, there was a question about the appointment of people into positions, senior positions of responsibility. I need to say this. The practice before 1994 had been that the person who becomes national commissioner in the police is one with a special branch background.
Yeah.
Now, special branch, those were political police, apartheid political police. We deliberately did not rush into just appointing a new police commissioner. But we spent a bit of time interacting with the senior leadership core of the police service, making our own assessments as to each individual's disposition towards serving the new dispensation. The person who was ultimately appointed by the president as commissioner of the new South African Police Service was George Fivers, who did not have that special branch background. And we were satisfied that he was committed to making a clean break on behalf of the service with the past. I think in the ranking order amongst what were called the generals then in the police, he was number 14.
Right.
And what tended to happen even before we came into into government, we are told that if someone was number 4 and they got appointed as national commissioner, you don't have to dismiss number 1 to number 3, they just leave. So it's what I guess you would call constructive dismissal. So that happened. So for the period that I was there, we set our sights on watching the transformation that we had set in motion, wanting to make sure that we deepen that transformation. Yeah, I'm accounting for that period.
Yeah. I'll come back just now to that question about the ones who left. But I first want to just ask Gareth his opinion on another aspect, because you mentioned there General Fivers, who was a career police officer. The present Commissioner Sithole is also a career police officer. 35 years, I think, experience in the SAP and then the SAPS. But along the way, we've also had, I want to say, experiments with non-career police officers. Jackie Selebi, for example, was never a police officer before he became National Commissioner. I think the same is true of Ria Piecha. And of the current minister, who, as we recall, in 2009 was made National Commissioner, Becky Cele. And then the debate runs, or should we always have a career officer who comes up through the ranks? Is that necessary? Or is it indeed completely the opposite, that for some reason we should bring in someone sideways from business or from foreign affairs or from wherever else? Gareth, where do you stand on that debate?
Well, I think, from the literature, one of the key characteristics of someone that's considered a successful or effective police leader is expertise, experience. Typically, they've been mentored, they understand the organization, but that in itself is not enough. To be really effective, you also got to have a vision, able to drive organizational change, able to inspire people, be a good communicator, be a critical and a creative thinker. These are various characteristics. So, it's quite a tall ask to find all these characteristics in one person. And we have experimented. The first experimentation was actually with Mayor Khan, who was the group CEO of SA Breweries, right, brought in to become chief executive officer under George Fivers. The idea being that, bring in sort of private sector management skills, we could create more efficiency and that kind of thing. So I think it wouldn't necessarily be that you could only have a police officer to be the National Commissioner. but certainly it probably would be desirable for the main purpose that if the person understood the organization, had been in the organization, understands how the various systems may operate well or not, be manipulated, they know what they're looking for, they've been there, they've been in the ranks, they also understand the experiences of police officers on the ground, the constable who has to go out at 6 o'clock at night in the middle of the winter and drive around the middle of Hillbrow, for example, or go and deal with, you know, terrible situations in rural areas. If they've got that experience, then their ability to understand what needs to be put in place to make sure that those frontline police officers have the necessary training, the necessary equipment, resources, but also the motivation. What would make them or motivate them to be doing the best job they could do would be very useful. So I would tend towards wanting someone with some kind of police expertise. This might be somebody who's been in the police, left, has other experience, and then comes back into the police, or it might be somebody who's been in the police and hasn't left. We do have some really excellent police officials across all ranks. And I would say maybe some of the top police managers in the world, given the experience that they've had. We've got police officers with master's degrees from Harvard, PhDs. So I would say that the process for appointing a police leader in South Africa is probably more important than deciding whether they should necessarily be a police officer or not. You want to really be very clear about the key characteristics, the key skills that they possess, their levels of integrity, their approach, their understanding of the Constitution, their outlook on life, what they think the police should be doing, their vision of policing. These are the kind of questions you need to interrogate through a process, so that by the time you get to a short list of people or a person that you think could do this job, which is, as was mentioned earlier, probably one of the more difficult jobs you can possibly hope to imagine, that you've got the best chance of having a leader who's going to inspire and drive an organization to become better, to perform better. So that's what I would maybe answer to that specific question.
Thanks. Dr. Mufamadi, it's interesting that you raised the question of if you appoint number 4, then number 1, 2, and 3 all immediately leave. You don't have to dismiss them. One of the perceptions that's out there, and I use the word perception because I'm not altogether sure that it's very accurate, is that in the police service, as in other areas of the general state service, the post-1994 government sort of set about getting rid of senior leadership and replacing, in the name of transformation, replacing the senior leadership with people who were more acceptable transformation candidates, whatever terminology was used. And yet, in fact, you took 2 years to appoint General Fivers. He was appointed in 1996. So in fact, the SAPS was, for those first 2 years of your tenure, still under the leadership that it had had at the end of the apartheid era. So tell us a little bit about that. Did you, in fact, lose a lot of the most experienced senior leadership? Did you lose a lot of the technical skills, the detection skills, the organizational skills within from the old SAP? Did you get rid of them, or did you encourage them to transform and stay in the new service?
Well, let me put it this way. The 2 years of studying the situation were also reinforced by active, shall I say, commissariat work. You know, you are talking about people who were in the front line of doing wrong things in the past. They even have some apprehension about the new order. So, you know, I don't know how many meetings around the country did I address of police officers, enlisting the support physically of President Mandela, attending those meetings, addressing police officers. We brought in, you remember that was the period of the government of national unity.
Yeah.
We brought in Prince Buthelezi and Mr. de Klerk, We even organized what we call a National Day of Safety and Security, where we brought the police and the community together. I'm trying to show you that there was no intention not to give anyone a chance to be part of the new order. Now, the options that, not Hanns, sorry, Gareth was talking about, a career police officer, a non-career person, someone from the private sector. All these options were available to us. But we said, this is a very big organization, 126,000 members at the time. If we go out and look for a police commissioner outside the police service, we will be making a statement we don't intend to make to serving members of the police service, that there are no prospects for upward mobility on their part. We don't trust the entire police service. That's why we had to take time to look from within. That was our rationale for looking from within, but also taking into account the commitment that you are able to see in the person that you are giving this kind of responsibility. But you see, there were other considerations beyond just saying career police officer, non-career police officer, but also this question of non-statutory forces. Because there are people who were in the armed forces, for instance, of the liberation movements, ANC, PAC, AZAPO, who were integrated, but they were a tiny minority into the police service. But as you can see, we did not even go for that option during my time. Yeah. Now, we are now talking about what we did more than 20 years later. More than 20 years later. I spoke about changing the curriculum. We set up a detective academy because one of the things we really lacked in was in the area of investigations in terms of lack of skills. Now, 20 how many years later now? 27 years later, we should be talking about a talent production process which is able to take us beyond the phantom SAP versus non-statutory forces divide when you are looking for a successor. But if you look at the marches in Cape Town, of course, some of the people who came from the non-statutory forces have proved themselves to be committed servants in the SAPS, serving the country. But the fact that even just at the level of optics, when there are issues in the police, the march is about, we want the reinstatement of MK commanders. Yeah. It must tell you that maybe we have not traversed sufficient distance in terms of saying we have now produced a talent pool from which we can begin to set up a new police leadership which is unencumbered by the divisions of the past. So it seems to me that if we are to solve this problem, this is the issue we need to address. A process of producing new skills space was started in 1997, 1998. How far have we gone with that? If the momentum has petered out, maybe that's where we need to concentrate to reinvigorate that process.
All right. Maybe we'll come towards the end of the discussion at suggestions of that nature of what is the way forward. First, want to go back to Gareth and just explore this question of the effect of the dysfunctions and the problems at leadership level on the performance of SAPS in general. I mean, clearly there's an assumption that in any organization, if the leadership is not performing well, and if it's beset with all sorts of internal battles and problems and so on, that will have an effect the lower down you go in the organization. But I'm wondering whether there's actually been any sort of studies, if there's any hard evidence to show that, for example, the very low rates of arrests and convictions that Hanns referred to, for example, and the areas of SAPS where the service is just not good enough, whether you can draw a straight line between that and the problems at leadership level. Questions around morale and motivation in the lower levels of the force. Have you done any work on that? Are you aware of work on that in that area?
Thanks. Well, I think when you're looking at a very large organization like the South African Police Service, it currently has about 180,000 personnel. To draw a clear line between the National Commissioner or the top leaders and what's happening at a specific place, one of the 1,154 police stations, is not really possible because every station's got a station commander, there are various managers at a station. The 9 provincial commissioners, they've got management teams around them along each of the kinds of program areas such as detectives, crime intelligence. But what we can do and what we have been doing is tracking 35 key indicators of SAPS performance as reported on in the annual reports to Parliament. And we track both the input indicators, in other words, the budgets, the personnel. We track the activities, what are they actually doing with the resources that they have. And then we look at the impact in terms of what is the outcome. And you see certainly that in the run up to 2010, there was a lot of improvement, largely because we had the World Cup, FIFA World Cup. Yeah. Everybody very positive frame of mind. A lot of investment had been taking place in the police in terms of budget since 2002. In fact, the organization grew by 68,000 odd posts from 132,000 people in 2002 to just under 200,000 people in 2012. So in the run up to 2010, there's a lot of focus on making sure that the police are doing these big operations, that there's a cohesiveness around what's going on there. Even though actually at the time it was where Jackie Celebi was on special leave and Tim Williams was the then acting National Commissioner. Becky Tsele got appointed in 2009, in the middle of 2009. But most of the preparation, the partnerships, and as I say, there are lots of managers doing different things in the police. So we saw many improvements actually in many of these indicators. Then in 2010-11, there was still a sense of some improvements. The afterglow of the World Cup was still in place. But from 2011-12, that financial year is when things started to start going south. Most of the indicators started to deteriorate. The budget, however, grew. So if you just look at the period 2012, the year that Becky Tsele was dismissed and Ria Pierre was appointed, and 2020, 2019, 2020, which is the latest year for which we have performance data of the police, you see quite an alarming picture. The budget goes up by 65%. So the police budget increases from 58.5 billion to 96.8 billion. So 38 billion rand more. Yeah. Most of this going into visible policing. So you see big increases in visible policing personnel, and most of the funding goes into the sort of key functions: detectives, investigations, intelligence, so forth. Administration, however, stays very flat. It only gets a 3% increase over that period. However, the personnel start declining. It declines by 6% in that 8-year period, from 199,000 police or personnel, not all of them are police, about 40,000 of those are civilian administrators, down to what is around 187,000 at the beginning of 2020. We're now looking at about 180,000 people. So that's about 12,000 fewer posts. Administration stays stable. Reservists drop by 77%, so from 30,000 reservists in 2012 to just under 7,000 last year. And we see although there's only a 6% drop in the personnel, we see quite large drops in the activities. So numbers of roadblocks drop by 40%, for example. Cordon and search operations drop by 89%. Air support operations drop by 82%. Numbers of vehicle search drop by 20%. The number of people searched drops by 92%. And that results in a number of other negative outcomes. The number of firearms recovered or confiscated drops quite considerably from 8,700 to 4,000. And that's when you start seeing the reduction also of detection rates. So the ability for police to solve murders drops by 38% in that 8-year period. In 2012, they could solve 31% of the murders that they were aware of. By last year, it's 19%. Robbery detection rates dropped by 24%, so from 22 to 16.9%. So you see that these performance indicators, despite the increase in money and a slight reduction in personnel, we see big drops in organizational performance. And now more recently, we've seen issues to do with the backlog in the DNA and a whole range of challenges. This is all about the leadership, because when you speak to top commanders, 32 lieutenant generals, 167 major generals, there are 200 generals in the South African Police Service. There's about 660 brigadiers that make up what's called the senior management echelon. Every time a new national commissioner or acting national commissioner gets appointed, they start rearranging things. They move people around, they bring in new people they will think are close to them or going to support them. They move people from one environment to another. And this is happening between 2012 and last year, every year or 2 years on average. And sometimes it's a period of 3 months goes past. For example, the last acting national commissioner, Lieutenant General Mutiba, is now retired, was only in the post for 3 or 4 months. But every one of them has their own vision plan and they would like to be appointed permanently, so they want to show that they're doing things and they start moving things around. And then when you start tracking, you see that a lot of these key people are changing posts quite very frequently. If that's happening at the top of the organization, there's no ability to do a clear plan, make sure implementation happens to a very large organization, assess the impact of that implementation, learn from the mistakes, and then adjust where necessary. Because the plan wasn't created by you. You've just been appointed in that key position, head of detectives, crime intelligence. There were about 8 people in crime intelligence after Mdluli was appointed in acting post. So there's no one who's actually really steering this ship. And so mistakes get made. Procurement doesn't happen properly. There's not a clear assessment of whether the training is being properly delivered and if it's having the desired impact on the ground. All that key management activity that you expect from the national officers and driven down to the provincial officers is not happening. And so literally big mistakes get made and they aren't rectified. And that means you get this huge reduction in the police ability to do the key functions that it's got more than enough money for and actually enough personnel for. But ultimately what's happening at those 1,154 police stations starts to become anyone's guess. Inspectorate falls apart after Jackie Selebi leaves, and many stations go for years without being inspected independently. So you have armed people in police stations with very little accountability, doing what they think they should be doing. And there's no real assessment from those whose job it is to lead the organization to determine whether they are doing what they're doing. And then very worryingly, not only is it about performance, it's also about the conduct. The ability for the police to hold a disciplinary hearing has dropped by 71%. So in 2012, they were having 5,700 disciplinary hearings a year. The last few years, it's been about 1,600. The police are not really interested in accountability. Based on the figures we have, you see IPID, 47,000 complaints, 1.3% ends up in a criminal conviction, and less than 4% in a disciplinary hearing. Most cases, cops do not get fired, even if there's serious findings against them. And then we see people turning to the courts. So the civil claim payout bill, 2.5 billion rand paid out to victims of police abuses in the last 5 years. So on every level, the ability for the organization to function, perform against its key targets, and its ability to make sure that it gains public trust are all hugely compromised. And those trends have not changed since 2012. They're continuing, as far as we understand, to this point in time.
Okay, this is not a very encouraging picture that you're giving us here. And yet you said earlier, there are still within the organization at all levels, a large number of very good, very competent people. And Dr. Mufamadi referred to the need to develop this talent pool. I guess the question is, how do we go about finding the best people, the most talented people within the organization, and allowing them to rise? Is there a magic formula here?
Well, I don't think there's either any silver bullet, and police reform is notoriously difficult, and there's more examples of failure than success internationally. And in fact, South Africa's reform initiative that is driven by our panelist, Dr. Mufamadi, is considered internationally as one of the success stories, from a brutal apartheid force to a police service that was oriented towards community policing, at least in the first 5 to 10 years of its existence. Interesting enough, there are a range of reports that look at this problem, starting with the National Development Plan in 2012.
Yeah.
Recognized, and I quote, the serial crisis of top management in the police. Saw that as a key issue. It's kind of hidden in the report, but it is there. And there are two key recommendations. First of all, for appointing the National Commissioner, that there should be a board set up similar to the way that the President Ramaphosa appointed the current National Director of Public Prosecutions, bringing experts who understand the field. They interview 12 or so candidates. There's a short list of people who make the minimum ability to become a candidate. Then do a rigorous, transparent, merit-based recruitment process, like most of us who work in organizations have to go through. Anyone can apply, there's a short list, and then but they look very carefully at your key criteria. So do that for the next appointment of the National Commissioner. So you make sure and that you get the best possible man or woman based on key characteristics. However, there's another problem, is that the police, these characteristics that we want from our National Commissioner have not been developed. They are developed for every other post, for provincial commissioners, for divisional commissioners, brigadiers. But the only criteria that the president is constrained by when making an appointment of the National Commissioner currently by law is that the person has to be over the age of 18, a South African-born citizen, and it does not have a criminal record, or is not facing disciplinary or criminal process. So whereas that means it's actually far more difficult to become a constable, because there's 18 criteria that you have to meet before you can become considered to become a constable, and 3 criteria considered if you're the National Commissioner. And as I say, you could literally throw a dart at a telephone book and that person would probably meet the criteria. So the next recommendation is set up a national police board consisting of people from different backgrounds and sectors who develop these criteria, then are responsible for assisting the police to do an assessment of those who currently hold posts, to make sure that the people in the posts are performing to the required standards, they fulfill the criteria of those posts. And when new appointments are made, that board helps with that process, the recruitment, selection, appointment process. Obviously, it's made by the National Commissioner, but that there is an independent process, because what we've seen for years is people being appointed using the various regulations without being assessed. Khomotso Phahlane that you mentioned earlier, in the 18 months that he was the National Commissioner, in the 2016-17 financial year, he made in the region of 80 appointments, 55 of those to top management positions without doing an assessment to determine whether that person that he was appointing to a key position had the skills, characteristics, abilities to actually perform. And that is 1 year. So this has been going on for a long time. So that unfortunately, out of those 200 generals, too many generals who probably should not be there and probably have skills that would be better used elsewhere in the organization. So there is a recommendation. Unfortunately, that recommendation in the National Development Plan has not been implemented. But since then, there's been a variety of reports. There's been the white paper on policing, adopted in 2016, that talks about what we would like from the police, and the issue of police leadership is considered there. There's a 2017 State of Democratic Policing in South Africa commissioned by the Civilian Secretariat, panel of experts report, Morricone report. All of these reports diagnose the problem and provide practical recommendations. Unfortunately, there's no evidence that any of these recommendations have been given serious consideration, and there's been really a serious attempt to implement them. So it's not that we need to start from scratch. We just really now need those recommendations to be implemented, and then hopefully that will lead to improvements in the police leadership.
Okay. Dr. Mufamadi, if I can bring you in here, Gareth has suggested and referred to existing recommendations around better ways of choosing senior leadership. I'm wondering whether there's a particular role here for Parliament. It's interesting to me that, for example, when we need a new public protector, a new auditor general, and various other of those very important constitutional offices, Parliament gets involved, calls for nominations, public hearings, etc. It's not to say that the eventual appointee is always a huge success, but at least there's a transparent and open process. When it comes to our judges, of course, we know we have the Judicial Service Commission, which once again undertakes an open process in which the public can say their say and at least observe what is happening and so on. Do you think it would be a good idea that the national head and maybe also the provincial heads of the SAPS would also undergo some sort of a process where the public representatives, our representatives, have some say in their appointment and selection?
Well, Gareth spoke about leadership and said, you need these technical skills, but you also need vision. And I think this tells us that we have to reflect very, very deeply about how to address this challenge. Because I think there is a lot of mindset shift that is required all around, which means we need a national discourse which educates all of us about this thing of governance that we are discussing. So that we don't find that one method of doing things is not working, we go for its apparent opposite, and because we think it's a panacea. We need a visionary leadership. Not only in government departments, but I'm talking visionary leadership in important organs of state. Building a police service which must serve the country. It's a matter of national interest.
Mm-hmm.
It can't be a matter of political football that is played in the national legislature and provincial legislatures. I'm saying this because there are people who have been appointed in other important sides of public service, appointed in the way that Gareth is talking about. Hearings in Parliament, multi-party committees, and they don't inspire, after they've been appointed through a process of that kind, they don't inspire the public confidence that they should inspire after they've been appointed. It must tell you that there is something wrong with issues of leadership. There are challenges with issues of leadership that need to be addressed. I know from my experience where I'm sitting now, I'm running a Center for Public Policy and African Studies. The majority of my students are public representatives from South Africa and the rest of SADC. Democracy does not always give us somebody who is equipped for the task, which is why we have to introduce this culture of lifelong learning. All round to continue to address these challenges. Hence, I'm saying, yes, because the challenges are immediate, we must look around for people we can find. But surely we have to invest in building a pipeline of people we can find to be deployed in these very important positions. You see, for instance, in 1994, when we were talking about the challenge of crime, there are certain crime tendencies which were not topical at the time. Homophobic crimes, femicide, infanticide. You must talk to people who go to police stations to report cases of this kind. And they tell you that they encounter police officers who do not think that these things are reportable cases. Mm. So, in other words, I'm saying that in what sense of change is our society changing? You need a leadership that tries to keep pace with this, understand that, because it's when you understand this that you then begin to see the changes, this changed the calculus about the resources allocation in the organization. You know, Gareth, you are saying at one point 12,000 members left the service. And it may well not be a real big problem, because we have to say, what are the skills profiles of these people who left the service? In other words, I am saying, because even if you have them, you may find that you don't have enough of those amongst them, of people who are trained to address the newly emerging crime typologies. And you can increase the police budget by 200%, and the police misallocate that budget. Leaving aside the issue of corruption, and they just misallocate the budget. The result, therefore, is that the police service will remain dysfunctional relative to the task at hand. Mm. Hence, I am saying that we need to do a lot of thinking. I mean, these governance challenges that we are facing are a challenge to researchers like Gareth. They are a challenge to the rest of civil society, to people in academia. Why is our system of education not producing people who can solve these problems? How socially relevant is what we are teaching in our universities? Sorry, I'm a retired politician, and if you give me a platform like this, I may end up just talking and talking. But I'm saying that we really need a lot of reflection. We are not in a situation where there are two obvious options of either or. You know, the menu of options that we have might necessitate that we think so deeply that hybrids of what is and innovative ways of doing things may be what we need to be able to go forward.
I must thank both of the panelists very, very much for their input and for the great openness with which you've given your analysis and your understanding. Dr. Mufamadi, Mr. Gareth Newham, hope also to have you back at some future stage. Hanns, I see you've come back. You want to say a few words quickly?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Dr. Mufamadi, and thanks, Gareth, and to the panel, I think to all participants. It strikes me always that in South Africa, in a way, you find all those brilliant people, and the analysis is brilliant. And we should be able to get this on the ground as well. So thank you very much, Mike, for the close cooperation and setting up such an excellent event.